and welcome to Wellness Live. My name is Dr. Olivia Moses, and we are excited that you are with us today because we have a very interesting topic. Now, if you're watching us live, it is January, and a lot of times during January, we think about health and wellness. And if you know Loma Linda, that's what we do. We do health and wellness here. And it's interesting though, when we think about our wellness, we also know that it needs active participation by us to be healthy and well. And the biggest excuse I think I make, and a lot of people I talk to make about not taking care of yourself, is time. I don't have enough time. I'm too busy. And that is a real thing, is having the time to take care of yourself. So because of that important topic, I have asked one of the busiest person in our organization to come and talk to us about how to fit wellness in a busy schedule. We have today Trevor Wright, who is our Chief Operating Officer of our hospitals, to talk about wellness and how he fits it into a busy schedule. Welcome, Trevor.
Thank you, Olivia. Thanks very much. Pleasure to be here. Now, I'll confess that it's a little nerve-wracking when all of a sudden you feel like you're the poster child of both busyness and wellness in a place like Loma Linda. But I'm thrilled to be here and share some of the thoughts and principles that I try and apply in my life, and I hope people find it informational and helpful, and I guess we'll know as we go along, yes. Right?
Great.
So thank you for the invitation. So I thought I'd start with a term that we are all very familiar with here at Loma Linda, and that's wholeness. And if you think about it, what is wholeness? The term itself means that something is complete. And we often talk about wellness and wholeness as they're interchangeable, and indeed they can be. I'm going to talk today about 3 areas that I think it is important to be focused and intentional about in order to be whole and to be well. Now, intentionality is one of the things that I think is the absolute most important principle about this. As Olivia spoke, people are busy. We're all busy. And yes, I have a busy schedule, but the things that we are intentional and prioritize are the things that we find a way to make time for. And the finding the way can oftentimes be the difficult component. But one of the reasons I believe that wellness and wholeness is so important is that if we are not intentional about living our very best life and trying to be as thoughtful and intentional about that as we can be for the people we love and who love us, then we're not giving our whole selves to them and to the things that we are called to do, that we do for work, and that we do for our passions. And so it's a foundational and important component, I believe, in order to live your very best life and the life that Christ intends and wants for all of us. So the first component is one we're probably the most familiar with. When you say wellness to any person in the street, they immediately think, aha, I know, diet, rest, and exercise. And that is absolutely true. The challenge oftentimes becomes in how do I make that work in real life? Because real life is messy. We can have the best intentions of meal prepping or being at the gym every day, but those intentions can oftentimes fall by the wayside when we let the other things that we feel we have no ability to move creep into our life. So I want to talk a little bit about my prioritization of physical wellness and what I had to do. The reality is I've always been an active person, and when I was younger and didn't have some of the responsibilities that I do now, like this job and family and those things, it was easier to be physical. And so you could incorporate it because, quite frankly, you had more leisure time. Well, now, fast forward to today, and all of a sudden life looks a whole lot different than it did at 20. At 50, there's a family, there's a job that goes from early until late. And so how do you do that? Because you can't just say, okay, well, on the weekend I'm going to do this or that. So for me, I could tell that I wasn't, even though I did plenty of walking and those things, I wasn't at the place physically that I wanted to be. The one thing I would also encourage everybody to do is to take where you are, no matter where that is today, and be intentional about being just a little better tomorrow than you were today. So it's just a matter of making a habit. So I assessed, I said, okay, how am I going to make this work? The reality of it is that because family is a priority, et cetera, the thing that as I looked at my life, and I'm an early morning person rather than late night person. So for me, what I had to do was I get up at 3:15 to go to the gym at 4. Now, I am by no means saying that's a great thing or look how nice that is or that's what you should do. But for me, it was the only way to be sure that I had a dedicated space carved out that I could focus on something that was, I considered foundational and important to be a part of the whole wellness component of my life. What I can also tell you is that no one in their right mind wakes up at 3:15 in the morning and says, yippee, let's go to the gym. But I can also tell you, just like you've read, I'm sure, after 2 weeks, it becomes a lot more reasonable and manageable. And as long as you balance that with going to bed at an early time, it can work for you. So it's not about that is the model, but for me, I think the principles are physical wellness becomes harder when life is busier. So if you do an assessment and say, what would be the most optimal way to carve out a piece of time, 30 to 45 minutes to an hour, that I can dedicate to actually being physically active in a way that makes sense. So that's what worked for me, and that was what I had to do in order to make that happen. I thought I might stop, Olivia, and see if there's any questions yet at this point.
Right.
That's like sanity about getting up at 3:15.
Sure. And just to remind you, if you're watching us live, you can ask Trevor some questions right now, and we have some coming in. So, Trevor, the first one is, what's one piece of advice that you can offer to someone who is just getting started with working on wholeness?
Well, I think I touched on it probably at the first. I think the very fact that you're asking the question about how do I get started with wholeness puts you in a really good spot. Because the desire to be whole is there. So then assess, I'd say, and I'm going to talk about the spiritual and mental piece. Take an inventory of where you're at and say, how do I take where I'm at and move that one step forward in each of those 3 areas? And that would be my thoughts.
Perfect. Another one is, does physical wholeness mean that I have to exercise every day?
Absolutely not.
Okay,
So I should
right,
that. So for me, it's 4 days a week. So it's 4 days a week, an hour a day, and on the weekends I intersperse some regular, hiking and those kind of things. So it is not like, okay, I've got to go from not doing anything to all of a sudden like, I'm a gym rat or, I'm running 4 miles a day every day. It's not that at all. It's one step forward, but I will tell you the difference between not working out and doing those things the way that I wasn't before, now just doing it 4 days 4 days a week has been light years worth of difference. So a little bit can make a big difference.
Yeah. Absolutely. So I want to ask you a question. You talked about you weren't where you wanted to be. So
Yes.
you assessed that.
Yep.
And I think a lot of people, we assess, but that next step into doing can be a little bit difficult. So how do we get from that assessing part to really motivate ourselves to actually do things?
It's a great question, and I think that it comes down to desire. For me, there was a couple things, right? I didn't feel as fit as I wanted to, and I could remember kind of what that felt like. And even for somebody who hasn't been, wouldn't have a reference point as to how to do that. Right. The desire is the important part, but think about why you're doing it. Like, why is it important to you? There's a reason. Everybody who's asking that question there's a reason you're asking.
Right.
So what's your why? The why will help you do. And what I would say is, as hard as it is, once you've assessed your why, here's your goal, here's why you want to do it, commit to doing it for 2 weeks and see where you're at.
Oh, that's great. Small steps. And what I loved what you said about you do it for yourself and your family, because a lot of times I think people have a hard time doing something just for themselves.
Sure.
They feel selfish in some kind of way, but you're doing it for you're doing it for the whole picture, the big picture. So I loved what you said here. Another question we have is, can our journey toward wholeness ever be completed?
I don't know that I'm an authority on this. I will say that nothing is perfect until we get to heaven. So on that journey here, I would say there's always some way to be a little better, which I think is a great thing. So as I would look at it, I would say, no, there's no finish line and like, okay, I'm finally here. But that would be how I would view it.
No, I love that answer, because a lot of people would say, he wakes up at 3:15 in the morning, you're good. You've reached your wholeness, that piece. But there's always something, because you feel it in here.
Yes.
And so another question I had, let's get back to this 3:15 in the morning. So I like that you said that no one gets excited about that.
Yeah.
It's not pleasurable. The bed is pleasurable at 3:15, in the morning. So what actually gets you out of bed in the days when you don't feel like it?
And now, let's be honest, there's a good bit of days that you don't feel like doing it. And it's easy to say, yeah, I don't know, because of, and you can come up with a list of excuses. For me, once you start justifying, if you've made a commitment to do it, I think it's important to remember, I just go back to the why. Why am I really doing it?
Right.
Because no one's making me. I mean, I can stop, etc. But I do think that, again, you can't be the most complete whole version of you for what you do and the people you love and everything in your life if you're not trying to do that. And so, I mean, that is kind of the why, really.
Right. And why not bring your A game when you can?
That's right.
That's great. Well, why don't we get to the second half
Yeah.
of your presentation?
So, knowing what the first bullet was, it probably won't be a surprise on the second one, but it's spiritual. Now, I might take this in just a slightly different tact from what might be considered typical. The spiritual relationship, and being here at Loma University Health is an incredible gift because it is a thread that is woven through every aspect of our culture. What spiritual wholeness means to me is the real further development of the personal relationship with God. And that doesn't mean just sitting in the church pew on a weekly basis. And for some people that might check that box. But what I'm really talking about here is a continual personal relationship with God, where you talk with Him. It doesn't have to be in church. It may be in nature. It may be driving in your car. It may be as you're walking from one place to another. Because like all relationships, you develop it on a personal level, and it grows and deepens as you nurture the relationship. So the intentionality of developing the relationship, for some people it works to have a dedicated time, just like a gym time, to have a dedicated devotional time, etc. Some people, it's a component of making time to find something to touch on at the end of the day and then have some thoughtful reflection about that. For others, it is a continual dialogue along with associated readings and materials to augment that. Whatever it is that works for you, I personally don't believe that you can have a complete, whole, well life without having an aspect that contains spiritual development and growth. And so, no matter what faith you are, or even if you are not, as you're watching this, the idea about communing with God is something that I think is critical to us as humans. And it's a hole that can't be filled any other way. And it is a relationship. But again, you need to do it for you because it's something that you desire. But I will tell you that is something that God desires more than anything else. And we know from the stories in the Bible. And so that would be one that if you think you have to have an intercessory or that you can't have that direct dialogue, I would really encourage you to find a way and a time to do that, because the aspects that it changes in your life and the relationships that you have outside of those with God, it's important. I think it's impossible to have a complete, whole, and well life without having that aspect and that relationship actively worked on and developed, and you taking an active part in that. For me, just the opposite of the gym time. I mean, that's the time in the evening when everybody's in bed and before I go to sleep. That's my time. But I will also say that there's not it's rare. It's rare to be for me any period of time, space of time more than a couple of hours out the day where I'm not in some sort of communication. But just like it's an inner dialogue that you have, and if you listen, I think that you can hear responses as well. And so it is a main component of my journey to wellness and wholeness as well. The last one I wanted to touch on is mental. And I think there's a lot of dialogue today about mental health, and it's important, and it absolutely is critical. What I mean about the development of mental health in terms of wholeness, I think this is one of the most overlooked aspects of wholeness and wellness. And what I mean by that is, when Olivia and I were talking earlier in the questions, we were talking about, sometimes people feel guilty about doing something for themselves. Mental health can fall into that aspect. In fact, there can sometimes be a connotation of, we'll remember, people say, well, I need to take a mental health day. And sometimes that's meaning people will say that like it's a joke. being thoughtful and diligent about your mental state of mind is really critically important. And in today's society, mental health, if you go back to the Blue Zone study and kind of the takeaways from that, one of the common threads that ran through there was the sense of community. In all of the Blue Zones scattered around the world, and we live in one, diet, exercise, etc., but community, sense of community and belonging and relationships have a great impact on your overall sense of health, sense of yourself, which really is mental health. And that is a component, I think, that is at greatest risk, quite frankly, today. If you talk to people about wellness, they will very easily go straight to, got to go to the gym, have the right diet, rest, got it. And they skip the other two, spiritual health and mental health, quite frankly. And mental health is impacted so much by our sense of connectedness and relationship with others. And then you heard me just talk about relationship with God. That loneliness is one of the key factors that influences people's overall health. In fact, the deaths of despair, we call them today, I mean, suicides on the rise, opioid addiction, et cetera, a lot of times find their roots in people feeling that it's just not worth it. And when you dig deeper into that, oftentimes they don't have the relationships and connections that allow for a full and positive mental picture of themselves. So I think that relationships with others and community and understanding it's okay when you're stressed, but acknowledge that and then say, okay, what are some things I can do to help alleviate that, or some exercises I can do to help bring my mental state back into a more aligned state of being. And I would suggest doing some reading on this, because there are some things very specifically that you can do, whether it's taking a pause or counting, and some of these things we've heard about our whole life, but they actually work, and it's important to acknowledge people where they are, but to recognize that if you don't take care of your mental health, no one else is going to do that for you, and no one else can do it for you. So those are the things that I try and be thoughtful and diligent about in my journey to wholeness. The last thing that I would say is really, as we're wrapping this component up before we get to additional questions and answers, is joy. You have to find things in your life that bring you joy. And these aren't the things that you do. I'm not just talking about things that are fun, but I mean, there are some things that you do that give you a deep sense of joy. And part of nurturing and taking care of yourself and mental health is allowing time and space for those things that bring you joy. And honestly, understanding what brings joy to others that are close to you, like your family or loved ones, promotes a great dialogue and relationship, but it also allows for an understanding about what those things are. And I've included just a couple pictures just to wrap this up. Now, so why does sitting down in a chair playing guitar give me joy? Well, I've been a musician my whole life. And it's one of those things that is very hard to find time for. But I'm intentional about doing it where I can. Yes, even if you're traveling in a pawn shop and you come across a guitar, you can sit down and play. I'll show you, this is the other things. I'm just showing you some things that bring me joy in my life. This is my family. I love riding dirt bikes and motocross, and this is us just last Monday out together for Martin Luther King Day all together. That's my daughter and my son. And here's my wife and my family. And this is what brings me joy in my life. But those things recharge your batteries. And all the focus on wellness and wholeness and balance and doing things that recharge your batteries and bring you joy allow you to live your best life for everybody you come in contact with professionally and personally, and allow you to devote more time, energy, and attention and focus to your profession as well. So those are my thoughts on this subject today, and happy to take any questions, Olivia.
So I want to talk to you a little bit about assessing, because you talked about assessing in each of these three. And a lot of times I think that all of us, we get into this whole survival mode and we're trucking through, and we might not even be paying attention, but we're just trying to survive each day. So what does assessment look like? And how do you know when you need one?
Yeah. I think it goes to one of the things I said at the very start was intentionality. So, because it is very easy to get caught up in the 1 foot forward, next thing, next appointment on the calendar, right? So weekend calendars filled, everything, right? You've got to be intentional first about carving out some space to do it. And for me, it was, all right, let's take these three big buckets. Where do I think how am I intentionally doing these things today? And so for the that was how I started. So I'm going to say that, because it's pretty simple, right? I didn't take a 15 question, checklist and go
Right.
through it. And that would have been a better way, but it was to simply say, where am I physically? And what do I really want? And so what are the things, why am I even, why am I assessing this? I must not be quite where I want to be, right? Well, what would that look like? So how do I need to do? Same thing spiritually. How am I intentional about this today? What does it look like current state? And then is that where I really want to be? Is that the finish line? And if not, what would it look like? Or what would the next step be? And the same thing with mental health. So I think for me, it was just saying, how am I doing in these three areas? And what could be better? And that's kind of the start.
So what I'm hearing you saying, number one, you have to take time to do it.
You do.
Right. So this is something that is a commitment that says, I'm not feeling joy, as you mentioned, or I'm not feeling right, I'm feeling stuck. There's something. Let me step back and take some time to look at what's going on with me.
Yep.
One. And then I hear you also saying that not only where am I now, where do I want to be? And then the question is then how you get there, and that comes into
Right.
everything that you've said.
And I think you just said something that is something I think that's really important to me, is that I think you have to believe that you are responsible for your life. If you have the viewpoint that life happens to you, it's very hard to be intentional. So, maybe even a foundational step before that is to realize that you are responsible for your life, and then how do I take from where I am and how do I make another step forward? Where do I want to be?
Right.
Because I think that's the step of saying it's difference between things happen and we'll just see how it goes,
Right.
versus what are the things I'm in control of and how am I intentional about making that better? Because there are things that are not in our control, but there are some things we are responsible for and in
Right.
control. How do we do that better?
I love that, because what that also says is not only am I responsible, I can actually be empowered to change something.
Yes.
And that's, I think sometimes we feel not in power of our own life.
Right.
To take that next step and feel like I can do something. And that's
Right.
the exciting part. Everybody can do something.
Right.
So let's get to some of our questions. So how has embracing wholeness benefited you as a leader? So how does it make you better in your job, basically?
Yeah, I think it yields benefits in innumerable ways. The first, I will just say from all three aspects, physical, mental, and spiritual, I think it allows you to bring greater focus to your life in whatever you're doing. So I believe that I'm better at my job because I'm intentional and focused on the things that I think are foundational to making me a whole and complete person. And it's one of our values. So I think that if I only was focused on work, and I will tell you, in our society, we glorify work above almost everything, right?
Yeah.
And so, but I think in a funny way, like an overused strength can be a weakness. Focusing only on work actually makes you weaker because that's all you're doing, right? There's no balance to the stool. So there's no question at all to me, specifically in focus, in clarity, in energy, in all those areas, wholeness has directly impacted my work positively.
Which is, I think, great. And I think it also makes work more fun.
It does.
It
absolutely.
allows you to enjoy and find joy in your work.
Yes.
Because when you don't feel that, then work is...
Oh, and that's the other thing I think I should mention. I didn't put it up here because it might have been weird, but I truly love what I do. I would rather be doing what I do than anything else. No one goes into healthcare because of the great hours and all this, but I'd rather do this than anything else. And I think that that's a key component because work is a huge aspect of our lives. So I think actually being even intentional about what you do, and even if it's something that isn't, that maybe isn't, you're like, well, I'm doing this because it does these things. What about it brings you joy? Which part of it are you really good? Being intentional about finding things that make better and light that fire, regardless of what it is that you do, is important, I think.
Which is great because we spend most of our waking hours at work.
Yep.
So why not enjoy it a little bit at least?
That's right.
So let's ask another question. When should we start talking to our children about wholeness?
I don't think there's ever a time to be that's too early, quite frankly. My kids know that seeing them and being with them in terms of time is important to me. And I don't think you can just say, well, it's quantity of time, it's quality of time, not quantity of time. I think you need to actually have both. Because I want my kids to understand a few things. Their personal relationship with God is important. Having balance in your life, we work hard, we take time for our family, and both of those things are equally as important. I want them to understand that early, because I want them to have that for their lives as they go forward, and families as they choose going forward as well. So I think the sooner they see it, and the sooner that you're talking about it, helps them establish, because they look to us to establish principles and model and all of those things. So the earlier the better, I think.
No, I agree. And modeling it is really important. So one of the things that you mentioned was mental health and the importance of that. And I love that you mentioned that, because I completely agree with you that when we think about wellness and health, it's, can I look like an Olympian? Can I be, this physical specimen of superiority over everybody else kind of thing?
Right.
And this whole mental aspect, I think, is kind of one of those that are in like the shadows that we don't like talking about, that if you're not mentally, if you're not a certain place mentally, then you're a weak person, and there's all these kinds of I think wrong thinking about mental health. So what would your advice be to someone who is in a stressful job, is in a demanding job, but doesn't think mental health is like a real thing?
Man, that's a very tough question, because if you're in a busy, demanding, and stressful job and you don't think mental health is a real thing, the honest answer I would give is, that's just denial. Because unfortunately, and quite frankly, that has a lot of the things that we see manifest themselves today, and what I mentioned is kind of deaths of despair, and there's varying degrees of that, sometimes at least that has to do sometimes with kind of denying that's even an issue, right? Because we're not supposed to show that, and so I'll just shove it down with chemicals or whatever it may be, but I'm not going to deal with it. Instead of acknowledging that there are things like, stress is a real thing, and so you have to find ways to help manage that. I think physical activity, scientifically has been proven to help manage stress. Relationships have been.
Sure.
Spiritual relationship helps with your mental health. So it all kind of coexists, but denial that that's a real thing will lead to probably other problems. And, I would just encourage, if there's an open mind to that, I'd say do some reading in today's world, because there's been some very good research that has been done on the impact and effects of mental health on physical health, and the ability to do things. And it's easily accessible and fine, and I would do some reading on that, because the connection between mental health and physical health and even diseases has been pretty well demonstrated.
Absolutely. And I think that mental health has been kind of in this whole, unfortunately, set into a realm of that's the touchy-feely kinds of things, and not necessarily a scientific health issue that, that we need addressing. So I think that's great. So another question came up. It says, who would you say helps keep you accountable in your path to wholeness?
My wife is one of the very best people in the world, and one of the ways that she helps me is exactly with this. We both have goals in all these areas together, and that's what I mean by relationships, right? Having somebody that you can lean on, who supports you, who knows what your goals are, and is supportive of those, and is your cheerleader and champion as well, and you serving in that role for them. That's one of the greatest gifts that's ever been given to me. But that's, she'll keep me accountable. I can tell you if I'm like, I really just don't feel like doing the things, like, remember why you started this, So, and that's exactly what you want, right? Sometimes you have a trainer who's encouraging and like, rah, 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 and sometimes they're like, okay, get off it and let's go, right?
Right. No, that's great. And it doesn't have to be a spouse. It can be a parent, a doctor. It can be a coworker, a friend. So we all, that accountability person can be really good, because it's much easier to lie to ourselves than other people.
Yeah, right.
So, you can do that. Okay, so we have one time for one last question. How important is routine in the path to wellness?
I would say it probably differs for everybody. I would say it's pretty important for me, because my schedule is really full all the time. Any day of the week, there's weekends included. It's always full. Right. So if I'm not intentional about a time and a schedule, it'll get lost in the shuffle. if it's, well, I'll come back to it and get to it. Like if I'm like, well, I'm not going to the gym morning, but I'll get to it tonight. That's just something I'm telling myself to make myself feel better, because I won't, because I'm tired at night.
Right.
And I'm not a night person. You know what I mean? So for me, I think schedule is really important, because then it gets built into your routine. And I think it's the best way of ensuring that you stay on the path.
Yeah, and create these habits.
Yes.
Really
right.
important. Well, thank you so much for coming and visiting us today.
Thank you,
We were
Olivia.
so great. And to all of you, thank you for joining us. And I think the big charge after this great session we had with Trevor today is, number one, in January, we're looking on 2020, stop and assess. So that's the charge that we have. Stop and assess, and let's find out where we want to be. So when we have our December Wellness Live, that we can maybe see some progress. My name is Dr. Olivia Moses. Thank you for joining us, and see you next time.